When is a mass killer a hero? When God says so. The screams echoed through the collapsing temple as stone crushed flesh and bone. 3,000 men and women, politicians, military leaders, civilians, servants, all dead in an instant. Their crime? Being Philistines. Their killer? A Hebrew strongman who prayed before slaughtering them. In today's world, we would call it the deadliest terrorist attack in history. The Bible calls its perpetrator a hero of faith. His name was Samson, and his body count rivals modern history's most notorious terrorists. Yet Sunday school children sing songs about his exploits. Parents name their sons after him. Pastors preach sermons celebrating his redemption. Religious art glorifies his final act of mass murder as divine justice. This is the blood-soaked hypocrisy at the heart of how we read Scripture. If Samson lived today, he would die by drone strike or languish in a maximum security prison. His methods, indiscriminate killing, targeting civilians, using animals as weapons of war, suicide attacks, violate every international law of armed conflict. The man who slaughtered 30 for their clothes after losing a bet, burned entire harvests using foxes with flaming tails, and massacred 1,000 with a donkey's jawbone before declaring, "I have made them a heap," would be denounced by world leaders as a violent extremist. Yet the Bible places him among its heroes. Hebrews 11 lists him alongside Abraham, Moses, and David, men of faith to be revered, not reviled. How can we possibly reconcile these two realities? The cognitive dissonance is deafening. Modern religious apologists scramble to contextualize Samson's brutality, arguing that ancient warfare operated under different moral codes. They point to his status as a divinely appointed judge, suggesting that heavenly mandate somehow sanitizes mass slaughter. Some even frame the temple collapse as a legitimate military target because Philistine leaders were present, as if the presence of civilians was merely collateral damage in a justified strike. But these explanations ring hollow when we confront the raw violence of the text. Samson's motivation was explicitly personal vengeance. "As they did to me, so I have done to them," Judges 15 verse 11. His final prayer before killing thousands was not about liberating his people, but about personal revenge. "Let me die with the Philistines." Judges 16 verse 30. This is the language of vendetta, not divine justice. The uncomfortable truth is that Samson represents our most primal instincts dressed in religious garb. The intoxicating fantasy that God not only permits but empowers our darkest impulses toward retribution. The text repeatedly tells us the Spirit of the Lord came upon him before his most violent acts, a theological framing that suggests divine approval for what would otherwise be condemned as atrocities. We cannot ignore the disturbing parallels to modern religious extremism. Terrorists today similarly claim divine sanction for violence against perceived enemies. They too believe they are instruments of God's judgment, delivering righteous vengeance against oppressors. The language of their manifestos often echoes Samson's justifications with eerie precision. When we celebrate Samson while condemning modern religious violence, we engage in a moral double standard that undermines our credibility. Samson's sexual exploits compound this moral confusion. He repeatedly violated his Nazirite vows through contact with corpses and drinking wine. He pursued Philistine women despite God's prohibition against intermarriage. He visited prostitutes and allowed his lust for Delilah to compromise his mission. Yet rather than condemning these behaviors, the narrative weaves them into God's mysterious plan to seek an occasion against the Philistines. Judges 14 verse 4. This is perhaps the most troubling aspect of Samson's story, the implication that God works through moral compromise and brutal violence. If Samson's methods were divinely sanctioned, what ethical boundaries exist for those claiming to act in God's name? The question haunts religious history, from the Crusades to colonial conquests to modern sectarian conflicts. Some scholars suggest that the book of Judges itself offers a critique of Samson, presenting him as emblematic of Israel's moral decay during a period when everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Judges 21 verse 25. His story appears at the end of a downward spiral of increasingly flawed judges, perhaps serving as a cautionary tale rather than a straightforward hero narrative. Under this reading, the text doesn't endorse Samson's violence, but rather showcases the brutal consequences of abandoning divine law for personal vendetta. Feminist biblical scholars like Phyllis Tribble go further, identifying Samson's story as a text of terror that reveals the patriarchal violence underlying much of biblical narrative. The women in Samson's story, his unnamed wife, the prostitute in Gaza, Delilah, are either collateral damage or villainized temptresses, their humanity erased in service to the male hero's journey. The Philistine women who died in the temple collapse don't even merit mention beyond their anonymous inclusion in the body count. The ethical whiplash intensifies when we consider how selectively religious communities apply Samson's example. No modern preacher advocates slaughtering enemies or burning fields, yet they extract moral lessons about faith and redemption from these same blood-soaked narratives. This hermeneutical cherry-picking allows us to sanitize the uncomfortable violence while preserving the theological framework that justified it. Perhaps the most honest approach is to acknowledge that Samson's story represents a profound moral challenge that cannot be easily resolved. It forces us to confront the gap between ancient and modern ethical frameworks, between religious ideals and human brutality, between divine purposes and human failings. It demands that we question our easy categorizations of heroes and terrorists, recognizing that such labels often reflect power and perspective more than objective moral assessment. What makes one person's violence sacred and another's profane? What transforms a terrorist into a hero? Is it simply the passage of time, the winner's privilege of writing history, or the theological framework that interprets the bloodshed? These questions should make us deeply uncomfortable, especially when we claim moral superiority over other religious traditions or condemn contemporary violence while glorifying biblical parallels. Samson stands at this ethical crossroads, challenging our comfortable moral certainties. His blood-stained hands reach across 3 millennia to confront us with our own inconsistencies, forcing us to decide whether divine mandate can ever justify what we would otherwise condemn as terrorism. There are no easy answers here, only the disquieting recognition that the line between sacred violence and terrorism may be far thinner than we care to admit. The bodies of 3,000 Philistines lay beneath the rubble, but they weren't the first to die in this centuries-old blood feud. The coastal plain of Canaan had long run red with the mingled blood of Hebrew and Philistine alike. This wasn't just Samson's personal vendetta. It was the latest brutal chapter in an existential struggle that threatened to erase Israel from history. The Philistines weren't merely political rivals. They were an existential threat armed with superior technology and a military advantage that had subjugated Israel for 40 years. Their monopoly on ironworking technology, 1 Samuel 13 verses 19 to 22, meant Israelites couldn't even sharpen their own farming tools without Philistine permission, much less forge weapons of war. This technological oppression reduced God's chosen people to vassals in their own promised land. Archaeological evidence confirms the biblical account of Philistine dominance. They were likely part of the Sea Peoples, who migrated from the Aegean region, bringing advanced military tactics and metallurgy that overwhelmed local populations throughout the Mediterranean. Their 5-city confederacy, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath, formed a stranglehold on Israel's western border. From these strongholds, they launched raids into Israelite territory, stealing crops, enslaving villagers, and forcibly collecting tribute. The religious dimension of this conflict cannot be overstated. While modern readers might see territorial disputes, ancient participants experienced cosmic warfare. Each Philistine victory was interpreted as their god Dagon triumphing over Yahweh. The temple Samson destroyed was no mere gathering place. It was Dagon's house, the epicenter of a religious system directly challenging Israel's covenant relationship with their God. When Philistines celebrated Samson's capture, they weren't merely rejoicing over a military victory but proclaiming, "Our God has delivered our enemy into our hands." Judges 16 verses 23 to 24. This context transforms our understanding of Samson's violence. He wasn't acting as a lone terrorist but as the embodiment of Israel's last desperate resistance against cultural and religious annihilation. The text repeatedly emphasizes that, in those days Israel had no king. Judges 17:6, 18:1, 19:1, 21:25, signaling a period of vulnerability and disorganization. Without centralized leadership or standing army, Israel relied on charismatic judges, divinely appointed deliverers who arose in times of crisis. The Book of Judges portrays a cyclical pattern. Israel sins, God allows oppression as punishment, the people cry out, and God raises a judge to deliver them. Each cycle grows more desperate, with increasingly flawed judges reflecting Israel's deteriorating spiritual condition. Samson represents the final, most compromised judge, a mirror held up to Israel's own moral confusion and religious syncretism. His personal failures, weakness for Philistine women, breaking Nazirite vows, pursuing vengeance rather than justice, parallel Israel's larger failures to maintain covenant faithfulness. Yet despite these flaws, the narrator insists that God was working through Samson to begin the deliverance of Israel from the hands of the Philistines. Judges 13 verse 5. This theological framing suggests that even Samson's moral failings were incorporated into divine purpose. Modern readers struggle with this tension between Samson's personal vendetta and God's national deliverance. How can such compromised means serve divine ends? Perhaps the text itself struggles with this question, presenting Samson as both divinely empowered and deeply flawed without fully resolving the contradiction. Some scholars suggest that Samson's story deliberately subverts heroic conventions. Unlike earlier judges who rallied troops and led armies, Samson fights alone, often for personal reasons. His isolation reflects Israel's fragmented condition, tribes failing to unite against common enemies, individuals pursuing their own interests rather than collective welfare. In this reading, Samson isn't presented as an ideal hero but as a tragically limited deliverer whose individual strength cannot compensate for national disunity. The historical context also illuminates Samson's puzzling relationships with Philistine women. These weren't merely personal indiscretions, but symbolized Israel's dangerous attraction to foreign cultures and religions, what prophets would later condemn as prostituting themselves to other gods. When Samson reveals the secret of his strength to Delilah, he's mirroring Israel's broader tendency to compromise their distinctive identity and divine calling for momentary pleasure or political advantage. Archaeological discoveries at Philistine sites reveal sophisticated urban centers with diverse cultural influences from across the Mediterranean. Their cosmopolitan lifestyle, with imported pottery, advanced architecture, and international trade connections, likely presented a seductive alternative to Israel's more austere covenant traditions. The biblical prohibition against intermarriage wasn't merely ethnic separation, but protection against religious assimilation that threatened Israel's unique relationship with Yahweh. Samson's final act, bringing down Dagon's temple during a religious festival, represents more than personal revenge. It strikes at the heart of Philistine religious and political power, demonstrating Yahweh's ultimate sovereignty even in apparent defeat. The narrator emphasizes that Samson killed more in his death than in his life, suggesting this wasn't merely destruction but a decisive theological statement in the cosmic conflict between Yahweh and rival deities. This historical and theological context doesn't neatly resolve the ethical questions surrounding Samson's violence, but it does complicate simplistic terrorist/hero dichotomies. His actions occur within a complex web of religious meaning, national survival, and divine purpose that transcends individual morality. The text presents God working not despite human failure but through it, a disturbing but persistent biblical theme from Jacob's deception to David's adultery to Peter's denial. The book of Judges concludes by noting that, in those days Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. Judges 21 verse 25. This final editorial comment suggests that Samson's story isn't meant to provide a moral exemplar but to illustrate the chaotic consequences of religious and political fragmentation. His violence isn't celebrated but contextualized within a fallen world where divine purposes unfold through deeply flawed human instruments. Perhaps this is the most challenging aspect of Samson's story for modern readers. The suggestion that God's redemptive work in history doesn't always align with our moral expectations or ethical frameworks. The text doesn't ask us to celebrate Samson's methods, but to recognize the mysterious ways divine purposes can emerge even through deeply compromised human actions. A theological perspective that offers no comfort to those seeking simple moral clarity in sacred texts. The name appears unexpectedly, nestled between warriors and prophets in Hebrews 11's celebrated catalogue of faith. And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, Hebrews 11 verse 32. The casual reader might miss it, but the theological implications are seismic. Samson, womanizer, vengeful killer, oathbreaker, stands enshrined in faith's hall of fame alongside Abraham, Moses, and David. This inclusion represents perhaps the most profound theological paradox in Samson's blood-soaked narrative. How could the New Testament authors elevate a man whose life seemed defined more by moral failure than faithful obedience? What divine calculus transforms a deeply flawed avenger into an exemplar of faith? The answer cuts to the heart of biblical theology's most uncomfortable truth. God's grace operates beyond the boundaries of human moral merit. The writer of Hebrews doesn't whitewash Samson's failures or recast his violence as unambiguous righteousness. Instead, the text acknowledges that all these heroes were commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised. Hebrews 11 verse 39. This framing suggests that their inclusion rests not on moral perfection but on moments of genuine trust amid profound imperfection. A theology of grace that scandalizes our merit-based intuitions. Biblical scholars note that Samson's placement in Hebrews 11 doesn't endorse his methods but recognizes the one consistent thread in his chaotic life. Despite his moral failures, he ultimately trusted God with his final breath. When Samson prayed before pulling down the temple, he acknowledged God as the source of his strength and placed himself in divine hands. This final surrender, Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more, represents a genuine, if belated, act of faith. This theological framing suggests that Samson's story isn't primarily about heroic violence, but about the tension between human failing and divine purpose. The biblical narrative presents Samson as simultaneously spirit-empowered and morally compromised, a paradox that challenges simplistic understandings of how God works in human history. The text never resolves this tension, leaving readers to wrestle with profound questions about divine sovereignty and human responsibility. Early Christian theologian Augustine grappled with this paradox, suggesting that Samson's final act wasn't suicide but martyrdom, a sacrificial death authorized by the same divine spirit that had empowered him throughout his life. We must not believe that Samson destroyed himself, Augustine wrote, except as one to whom the Spirit secretly ordered this. This interpretation, while troubling to modern readers, reflects the text's insistence that God's Spirit worked through Samson despite his moral failings. Jewish interpretive traditions offer another perspective. The Talmud and Midrashic literature portray Samson as a flawed but necessary deliverer whose strength represented God's ongoing commitment to Israel despite their collective unfaithfulness. His compromised character becomes a mirror reflecting Israel's own religious inconsistency during the period of the Judges. In this reading, Samson's inclusion in faith's genealogy demonstrates God's persistence in working through imperfect human instruments to accomplish divine purposes. Contemporary theologians like Walter Brueggemann suggest that Samson represents a wild card in Israel's religious history, a figure who operates outside conventional moral boundaries yet remains within God's mysterious providence. His story challenges neat theological systems that attempt to confine divine action within human ethical frameworks. The text presents God working not only through the morally exemplary but also through the deeply compromised, a theological perspective that offers both comfort and disturbance. This tension between divine purpose and human failing extends beyond Samson to the broader biblical narrative. Abraham deceives and endangers his wife. Jacob schemes and manipulates. Moses kills and doubts. David commits adultery and murder. Peter denies. Paul persecutes. Yet all appear in faith's hall of fame. This persistent pattern suggests that biblical faith isn't about moral perfection but about broken vessels somehow carrying divine presence. The most radical theological claim emerging from Samson's story is that God's redemptive purposes cannot be thwarted even by human failing. The text repeatedly emphasizes that Samson's interactions with Philistines, even his morally questionable pursuits of Philistine women, were being used by God to seek an occasion against the Philistines. Judges 14 verse 4. This doesn't excuse Samson's behavior but suggests a divine sovereignty that operates beyond human moral categories. For many believers throughout history, this paradox has offered profound comfort. If God could work through someone as compromised as Samson, perhaps divine purposes might unfold even through their own moral failures and inconsistencies. The theological message isn't that moral behavior is irrelevant, but that God's grace transcends human merit, a central claim of both Jewish and Christian traditions. Critics rightfully question whether this theological framing provides dangerous justification for violence done in God's name. If Samson's violence served divine purposes, what prevents modern extremists from claiming similar divine sanction? The text offers no simple resolution to this danger, leaving readers to wrestle with the ethical implications of a God who works through deeply flawed human instruments. Perhaps the most honest theological approach is to acknowledge that Samson's story presents a God who refuses to be domesticated by human moral expectations. A wild, untamed deity who works through unlikely vessels and mysterious means. This theological perspective doesn't resolve the ethical questions surrounding Samson's violence, but places them within a larger narrative of divine redemption unfolding through human history in ways that often confound our moral intuitions. Samson's inclusion in Faith's Hall of Fame ultimately points to the Bible's most persistent theological claim, that God's relationship with humanity has never depended on human moral perfection. From Genesis to Revelation, the biblical narrative presents divine grace operating precisely where human merit fails, a theology that offers hope to the broken while refusing to provide easy ethical answers. This paradox remains unresolved in the text itself, which neither fully condemns nor unreservedly celebrates Samson's violent methods. Perhaps this interpretive tension is intentional, an invitation for readers to wrestle with fundamental questions about divine purpose, human responsibility, and the complex relationship between faith and ethics that continues to challenge religious communities today.